different companies approach innovation and product development. So one of the things I see very commonly is what I like to call a linear, sort of passive, non-integrated way of innovating. And what I mean by that is you have a market with all these opportunities, future trends, etc., all this information that you need to somehow act upon to create a new innovation project. But usually it's mainly the business guys who have access to that. Maybe it's your sales, marketing people, and they're the ones that usually have the decision-making authority to decide we're going to do this, we're going to create this innovation project. They might interface with R&D just a little bit, depends on your organization, but typically this gets decided top-down. Now you have your R&D departments that's tasked with innovating, developing this product that business wants to launch, for example. And they start, as they're innovating, they say, hey, I have something I think might be patentable. Or maybe the IP department, which typically only interfaces with the R&D department for the most part, is pushing them for patentable inventions, saying, hey, I'd like to file patents here. So you get limited interaction between the different groups in the company. You get this very linear sort of workflow. And IP ends up sort of just focusing on, can we patent it or not? And each time they get an invention, they're looking to see what prior patents exist, what have our competitors already filed, and just generally, what's the prior art. But it's a very narrow focus on just this invention and what prior art might exist against this invention. Is it patentable or not? It's not looking at their competitors' broader technologies, their strengths and weaknesses, what R&D investments are they making, which I'll show later in my presentation is all information you can gain from an IP analysis. So the disadvantages, as I kind of touched upon just now, in this sort of passive model is IP counsel basically has a passive position in the organization. They have little influence on structuring the innovation in the first place to maximize IP protection and minimize risk from the outset of the project. Number three, I see decisions made by many business people with not a full understanding of the state of the competitor technology, what tech trends exist, what are the really hot or active markets, what are the patent risks existing in those markets, what's the state of the prior art, how's that compared to our knowledge internally in our organization and what we can do. It's a lot of information to try to get a handle on, and it's usually decisions are made on, maybe they run a market report, maybe they buy a commercial market report, maybe they get a little bit of intelligence from the sales guys, or people have, interface with the customers, but I don't see the decisions being made on an analysis of the IP situation in a market, for example. Also, when your R&D staff is not actively participating in looking at the prior art and understanding the state of technology as disclosed by patents, for example, and any public disclosure out there that they can have access to, there's a lot of reinventing the wheel that goes on. I've seen studies that have shown that up to 30 to 50% of what companies do is reinventing the wheel simply because they don't have good access to information in a way that they can actually act upon it. And some of that reinventing the wheel, believe it or not, and I see this at my company, unfortunately, is stuff that we did 10 years ago, but no one remembers, and we don't have good record keeping so that no one can look up real quickly and say, hey, have we ever sampled this chemical before and tried it? There's no central system or what I like to call a company memory that's easily accessible to see what has the company done in the past. And another disadvantage of this sort of passive way of doing innovation with IP taking the back seat is, we're not leading with what's our protection strategy, what risks exist, et cetera. Basically, once the innovation is started and R&D started, now IP counsel, especially outside counsel, is just given an invention disclosure and said, hey, we want to file a patent on this. There's real no questioning of the strategy and what the actual value of that's going to be to the business. And when that happens, you don't build a fence, you don't build protection like a real portfolio, valuable portfolio. You end up filing these piecemeal patents. And they don't necessarily relate to each other. And I've seen this a lot in reviewing companies' portfolios is I look through the scope of all the patents and I'm constantly asking myself, what does this get them? Why was this investment worthwhile? So in contrast, the kind of innovation that I like to see is active and integrated, which means that in your company, all of your key departments, your business guys, your R&D guys, and your legal guys, whether they're in-house or outside counsel, are actively involved at the outset in figuring out what's our strategy moving forward. And there's good lines of communication between them. To make this happen, sometimes it requires a change in the way your organization runs. It could require some introduction of new formal procedures, et cetera. But I think this is really key to the companies that innovate well, is the sort of, triple threat, if you want to call it, of experienced departments really coming together and making it happen. And these decisions are made, this information is not just fed into business. All these guys have access to this information and can comment on it and think about it from their unique specialized backgrounds. And your competitor situation too is furthermore more fully digested. You're not just looking at, can we patent this thing? You're looking at, what are our competitors doing based on their patent activity? What are they disclosing in their patents? What does that tell about the market and where we might find interest, et cetera, as I'll discuss a little bit in part 2. So whenever I talk about this stuff in my own company, a lot of times my audience is these big R&D groups, and it's really hard to get them excited about IP. So I found out that if I talk about Starship, they tend to, their ears perk up, Star Trek and the Starship Enterprise, their ears perk up a little bit. I'm pretty nerdy myself too, but so hopefully you appreciate the analogy. But I was watching one of the more recent Star Trek movies, and it got me thinking that a company, what I'm talking about here is really similar to the Starship Enterprise and the way Captain Kirk, Scotty, and Mr. Spock really interact together. So, innovation is basically boldly going where no man has gone before, hopefully, is what you're aiming for. And to do that, like I said, internally, when you're integrating your company's functions and decision-making processes, your business guys tend to be Captain Kirk. They're like, fire all torpedoes and engage warp speed drive on my command. And not to cast too black and white of a stereotype, but I do find most of the business guys I interact with are kind of looking out, what's going on and make decisions. They're willing to take risks, for example. Scotty's saying, I can't do the Scotty impersonation, but she can't take no more of the thrusters are damaged and we don't have capacity in our warp core. He's your technical guy. He's going to say, listen, if you want to engage in this innovation project, we don't have the technical capacity to do this in-house. We might have to come up with another solution. So it's key that your R&D is always involved to make sure that what you're doing is technically feasible. And Mr. Spock, well, he's your, hopefully, legal counsel. He's remains, very impartial most of the time, and advises you, here are the risks of this maneuver. And sometimes Captain Kirk, I'm going to do it anyway, and that's fine as long as your legal counsel's doing the job of Mr. Spock and thinking about things logically and making sure the other guys understand what the risks are that they're taking on. In terms of externally integrating all the information before you do an innovation project, what this means to me is, pardon my pun here, but I thought Klingons would be more funny for competitors since they're clinging on to your technology and maybe mimicking you. But essentially, before you explore the new frontiers, right, you need to figure out you have to explore the current territories and figure out what risks are there. So you have all these patents existing that your competitors have thrown out in the market space, okay? Before you go to the new frontiers, you have to figure out what's the path through these patents. That's a freedom to operate analysis. Hopefully, as a starting point for any company that's doing innovation, they have to do this. They absolutely have to. I have a friend who lost his multi-million-dollar company because he didn't do this, and it was because of a blocking patent that they refused to license. And so I can speak from firsthand experience that making sure you search the patent landscape before you embark on your innovation is essential. So at the least, you look at risk and say, what are the risks out there? Can we navigate around those? That would be designing around the patents, for example. Maybe you plow through the patent, you do invalidity opinion, or you actually oppose the patent. So there are various ways you can deal with these, but you at least have to understand what are the landmines existing out there. And then you get to the new frontiers, and hopefully you can protect those. Another thing I want to mention here is, hopefully as you're aware, every patent application is published after 18 months from filing. So you have this public disclosure of your competitor's technology. They're basically telling you, this is the patent system, right? In return for filing patents, you get 20 years of protection, but you have to disclose it to the public, generally speaking. And so that way people can advance the progress of science and the useful arts as mandated in the Constitution. But there's so many patents out there that it's become very unrealistic for people to navigate and mine all that information. And I want to show you some examples of how you can do that later on, but very key to understand the landscape you're entering based on not just the risks, but what are they disclosing in their patents? Every patent is a problem and a solution, an inventive solution. Even just identifying what problems your competitors have already discovered and what are their ways of solving those problems can give you a real advantage in innovating and competing with them. So to kind of make this a little more concrete, when I talk about internal and external integration to achieve good innovation, what I'm talking about is, from an organizational standpoint, is internally, as I just showed you with the Star Trek example, is getting people integrated into the decision-making process. Structurally, this would involve introducing formal systems and procedures at your company for really driving innovation, including, hopefully, you may have heard of ideation processes. If you're from a big company, I'm sure you're familiar with stage gate or design review. These are formal processes for making sure that before each critical investment or each stage in the innovation process, all the T's are crossed, all the I's are dotted. Each business, technical, and legal have done their study, done their due diligence to make sure everything's okay before the next step forward. So no one gets, business has a tendency to run fast ahead of R&D sometimes. So everyone gets on the same page and the company goes forward in a systematic way. External integration is, how do you get all that information I showed you from the market and outside into your company in a way that they can act upon that information? So this can be, there's all kinds of ways of doing this. One is if you have a tech service team, like you have technical service department at your company, sales personnel, et cetera, anyone who's getting questions fielded from the market, potential customers saying, hey, can you do this? Or do you know of a product that's capable of doing this? Take that information and don't let it just sit with those guys. Integrate that somehow, record it in your company, put it through a review process and act upon it to make sure that those opportunities are not missed. Okay. In terms of key roles, it's easier said than done. For some companies that don't have this sort of culture or environment established already, it really takes a heightened commitment on everyone's part to innovate successfully. One is that your business executives have to be willing to understand at least some basic principles of intellectual asset management, which I'll discuss a little bit later. And forgive me, IP counsel sitting here, but we need to be held accountable for the value of our activities. I actually appreciate it when company presidents have asked me, what are we getting out of this IP portfolio? I've spent $1 million on this in the last few years. What am I getting out of it? How does it contribute to the bottom line? These are good questions, and it gives us an opportunity to really, show the value and make some hard decisions on what's the best path forward for the IP strategy. For R&D and technical team, it's being held accountable for understanding the state of the prior art and competitor activities and innovating based upon that knowledge. This seems like a given to me, but you'd be amazed at how hard it is to get R&D guys to read patents. This is one reason I started developing tools to basically make it easier for them to see what they want to see out of the patents rather than having to pick up patents and read through them, because that's like pulling teeth to get guys to read. One of my favorite guys I work with in R&D, he's got a stack of patents on his desk this tall, and whenever I talked to him about his project, he said, I was reading this patent and I couldn't believe that this company was doing this. If we did this, I bet we could do it a lot better. And it's like, yes, that's what we're trying to achieve. But it's hard. So, getting your R&D to that commitment level might take hiring people like that at the outset, making it clear when you hire them, this is what we expect from you, and making incentives or penalties for not participating actively and really reviewing the state of the prior art. And of course, they need to understand the basics of patents so that they're more effective in participating in the ideation process, so that, when IP Council has a discussion with them, hopefully they've already got a lot of the work done and things are already on their way to filing a good patent. For legal and IP counsel, this is the perspective that I've gained at my company anyway. The traditional role, hopefully many of you are familiar with, is basically what I call just sort of the basic skill set of IP counsel. It's doing invention reviews, filing patents, doing some patent searching maybe, writing invalidity or non-infringement opinions, working with IP-related agreements, and sometimes supporting IP litigation. But for me, the heightened role, if a company is going to innovate successfully and really incorporate this IP sort of understanding into their innovation projects, IP counsel need to have some business acumen. We need to have the ability to speak the language of business if we want to structure the innovation, really have a strong influence on it. This involves intellectual asset management skills, which I'll touch upon briefly today, and really understanding the market from an IP perspective so that it's no longer about just increasing patent numbers, it's about strategic IP protection in light of the situation out there. So for the IP counsel that are still here and not enjoying the nice weather out, this is my advice, at least from the School of Hard Knocks. If you want to earn your spot on the ship's bridge and really get involved in the business aspects of your company, you have to be willing to talk honestly about the real value of the patent portfolio. It's going to be discovered eventually anyway. You can't hide behind it. Eventually, people are going to start scratching their heads, and when budgets get reduced, they're going to want to know, do we really need to spend this much money on this activity? But that value has to be clarified. And learning just the language of business and developing a realistic understanding of how IP practice fits in there. Don't be the overzealous, reduce risk to zero type of person. Be Mr. Spock and clarify risk for people. Let them make the decisions if they need to. And just develop a good relationship with the other departments so that no one thinks you're getting in the way, as you've probably maybe some in-house counsel has experienced before. Don't get in the way. We don't want to deal with that. I want to discuss 3 and 4 in a little more detail in the next slides, but one of the eye-opening experiences for me at my company was no longer just focusing on patents, but thinking broader into intellectual asset management. And I'll discuss that in a bit. And also figuring out how to leverage competitor information in a way that's useful for business and R&D decisions. And the last one, unfortunately, that could be a topic for a whole other presentation, but creating techniques to basically evaluate and monitor the worth of the portfolio ongoing so that you can show the success or failure of the activities in an ongoing way. And it's not a surprise discussion when the president comes up to you and says, what are we getting out of this? You can show them, here's how our portfolio has performed over the last 5 years. Here's the ups and downs. Here's the value. So breaking out one of those last bullet points in the last slide, what do I mean by intellectual asset management? If you're an IP person, you've never seen this, I hope you learn this stuff. If you're a non-IP person, I think it's still useful, whether you're general legal counsel. This has been one of the most invaluable diagrams I've ever used in my job because it's a great starting point for discussion with business executives, to get them thinking more broadly, and it touches upon all kinds of departments in your organization. So essentially, the point here is that your company, this is your company, right? And your company has intellectual capital. Okay, part of that is your human capital. These are the people you hire. This is your HR department's duty, hopefully, but to find good people that have good skill and experience, et cetera, that can create and innovate. But you can't own people, obviously, nor do we want to. But you can own ideas. So part of the job of an intellectual asset manager is making sure that all the ideas and really the know-how that's being contributed from those skilled people gets recorded in the company, okay, formally recorded. And at that stage, you pretty much have intellectual assets. This is the know-how, potentially not trade secrets yet, but know-how, just the act of recording it and managing it as part of your company records, making it accessible. This is a huge value. If you're looking at two different companies that you wanted to potentially acquire, and one company had a bunch of skilled people, but they had no formal record of what they've done and their ideas and inventions and their experimental notebooks, et cetera. And the other company did have that. I think you're going to choose the company that has the formal recordings, because that's a real value. It's hard to quantify that value, but that's the value of intellectual assets. And the portion of intellectual assets that gets turned into intellectual property is really what we mean by IP. I use IP loosely all the time because it's just too hard to say intellectual asset management over and over again. But really, IP is a small part of your organization. Okay, it's this portion of your recorded know-how and ideas that is worth filing a patent on, that is strategic to turn into a patent. Or maybe it's your trade secrets, maybe it's your copyrights. And again, this is another process that I hope you will have in your company, which is basically figuring out in a formal way, doing invention review committees, et cetera. What are we actually going to protect out of this intellectual asset pool? And as you're creating all of this intellectual property, you're working with your structural capital. So you're figuring out, you're using the infrastructure so you can analyze, do we have that in place? And can we leverage these assets using our complementary assets, such as manufacturing, distribution, our branding, to actually make profit off of this? Another thing you have to consider. So, I could talk at length about this slide, but it's a good starting point to begin the discussion and see, do we have all of this together at the company or not? Really briefly, when you shift the mindset from patents to intellectual assets, it's no longer can we patent it, it's can we protect it. There's other ways to protect intellectual assets. You enter into contractual agreements, defensive publications to prevent others from patenting, do trade secret protection, which takes more, as I've told my subsidiaries. You can't just say we have trade secrets, you have to actually show what you're doing to protect that know-how. It's not, you don't just get trade secret protection, you have to actually engage in steps to protect the information. Instead of doing narrow prior art searches for each invention, you do landscape analysis. You look at each project to assess the overall strategy for protection and how each invention relates within that strategy. Instead of asking how many patents do we have, we look at what's the actual value of the IP portfolio to the business. Instead of looking at each patent individually, we look at that patent in relation to its corresponding product, its revenue, the overall portfolio, and how it relates to our competitor activities. And instead of doing just a patent infringement search, which is narrow, it's taking these product attributes and seeing, does this infringe a patent? We do a broader landscape search to understand, get some competitive intelligence on where our competitors are investing, what are the technology trends, et cetera. Let me take a quick water break here. Okay, so in the remaining 10 minutes or so, I want to go through part 2 here with you. And I apologize, I got to speed the pace up a little bit, but I want to go into some concrete examples of what I'm talking about with IP analysis. If you're from a big company, hopefully these concepts are really familiar to you. So before doing any major innovation project, you at least have to do a market feasibility, a technical feasibility, and a legal feasibility study. If you have what are called stage gate procedures at your company, hopefully this is all built in and people just do it because they have to. If not, then I highly recommend, if your company or the clients you represent are involved in innovation, that this is something you advise them on. But essentially, it's market feasibility, what's the state of the relevant market, what's our entry strategy, who are the key players, what's our projected share, technical feasibilities, how do we realize this technology with minimal investment, what's our manufacturing capability for this, what's our projected costs on that. And legal is, what are the legal risks, how do we resolve them, and how do we protect this investment? I want to show now how IP analysis can touch upon all of these factors. So from an IP perspective, when you do a market study, so I'm talking about the market study, so as market, technical, and legal are the three we need to remember, right? So market, you look at, based on the patenting activity in a relevant market, we can see who are the key players, emerging players, fading players, emerging and fading markets, geographical focus, et cetera. And the goal is to basically build awareness of business managers regarding what our competitors are focused on, what their strengths and weaknesses are, and what's the winning innovation strategy for us in relation to a lot of the information. So I'm really showing some basic examples here, but as an example, in a market study, one thing you can look at, I'm just gonna come down here because it's easier for me to, so for the widget, right? If we're gonna innovate a widget, we can do a patent search on that widget and see what are the filing trends historically for patents that include or cover that widget, okay? Well, we can see in the 80s, there's a little bit of a surge in activity. These are company names. I just abbreviated with to be anonymous, but you know, company C had 6 patents. You kind of had a scattered effort there with some activity. Over the 90s, you can see that there wasn't a real strong focus. And the presumption here is if companies are investing money to file patents on things, that means they're investing in innovation here. So patents are a good reflection of the level of innovation happening in a company in a particular area. So here you see a lot of scattered players. Company K had the lead with 6 patents. And now all of a sudden about 2000, you have this surge, this increase in activity, and some real dominant companies coming out. Company R with 36 patents, et cetera, which shows a very strong interest in the market, some new need in the consumer market that these companies are all investing heavily and innovating in because they're filing a lot of patents. And here now you see companies, you know, company P has now risen to the dominant in terms of patenting activity and potentially R&D activity. And you can see the major players, just the top ones. So company P is leading here in 69 patents, company R is 52, et cetera. So now you know who are the key players in this market that we need to worry about. For major markets, you can see where are the patents being filed. As you know, you only get protection where you actually file the patent. So you can see here, well, the US is at the top, Europe, Japan, Germany, Australia are kind of in the top in terms of where companies are wanting to protect this technology. So that gives you some idea of what markets are of interest for this widget. This kind of study basically shows, what this is showing is a pending patent means it's not issued yet, okay? It's just been filed and published and maybe rejected, we don't know, but it hasn't issued. And the active patents are the ones that are issued and still alive, okay? So what this shows is you have a whole, basically the percentage of patents that are pending in the overall market and the percentage of patents that are active in the overall market as held by each company. So here we can see company P, company R, company P has 14.2% of all the active patents existing in this market. And they also have 12.7% of the pending patents, which means not only do they have a strong established position in this market, but they also have filed a lot of patents that are still waiting to be issued potentially. So they're investing in R&D still, and they have a strong position. Same with these other companies. Company H, they have a lot of active patents, but for some reason their pending application percentage is really decreasing in the overall market, which means that their R&D investment is probably waning. And we actually figured out, you know, this is anonymous data, but we figured out that the reason was because this company they combined with this company, S, that is starting to increase their innovation or their investment, and they have few active patents. So they're basically kicking their R&D over to this company is what we found out in this particular study. And that was really interesting to learn about because we were targeting this company as a potential partner, and we were doing it all wrong. We figured out, oh, we should have been going for these guys in terms of, you know, doing potential collaborations. These guys we can ignore because they have little or no patent rights, either pending or active. So these are the kind of useful data, hopefully you can see, that you can extract just from some simple patent information and get an idea, correlate this with what's actually going on in the market. When I show this data to people at companies, one of the neatest things is to hear them say, oh, that makes sense because we were talking to so-and-so the other day and we heard that they were bumping up their R&D efforts. So to see it actually correlate with the data is really neat. You can also do a market study where you look at, let's say your widget could be used in a lot of different application areas. So it could be used in packaging or gaskets or automotive applications, for example. And you want to get an idea of where could we potentially use this widget, where could we potentially sell it, and if we develop into that space, where are the patent rights existing? So here you can see that if we want to sell a widget and potentially do innovation for widgets in automobiles, well, company P is dominant. They have a lot of patents in this. Company S, don't need to worry about them. Maybe we need to assess company P and see, what we can do to either work together or compete with them. And also the most popular use of the widgets in automobiles. Are we selling in automobiles? Maybe we're not. Maybe we need to consider selling there. Or maybe because of this, we look at it and say there's too much competition. But what about home appliances? Maybe we look at home appliances and we say, okay, well, there's kind of scattered, just a few patents filed by each company, no big effort existing there. So there's still a chance for us. Maybe we have know-how in that area and we could leverage it here. Fiber optic applications, only one patent, not popular. Does this mean it's hard to innovate there? Or is just no one recognized the value there? Maybe we should investigate that. So these are all things we can start deducing from publicly available information. From a technical feasibility perspective is looking at the real problems and solutions identified by your competitors. If your R&D guys have an easy way to access that information, that can be really useful. If they know, imagine if you have a database that basically lists all the problems identified by your competitors and all the solutions that they've put in their patents. Now when your R&D goes to work on that same problem, they just look it up. Instead of reinventing the wheel internally and saying, how can I solve this? They look up the problem, they see, here are the 10 solutions, 10 ways to solve this problem as already solved by our competitors. Okay, maybe we need to do it a different way, or maybe we can copy it, depending on the situation. You can see all this other stuff here, common and potential manufacturing techniques, potential new uses for existing technologies. So again, it's building the state of awareness of your R&D, making sure that they're not duplicating the efforts of others, and avoiding patent risk naturally, because if they are aware of the patent rights that are existing out there, they're going to naturally avoid those risks. So here's an example that could be used in a technical study, another basic example, but let's say we're trying to solve these kind of problems, okay, for the widget. What if our widget has poor insulation properties? Okay, well, this company R, has already filed 3 patents recognizing that problem with a solution. So we can actually, in the software I use, I can just click on this bar and it shows me what those patents are, and I can just look at them, for example. The other ones we can look at, there's a lot of conclusions you can make from this data. Company P is uniquely recognizing poor widget density, for example. Poor density, you only have company P recognizing that problem. Why is that? What's company P up to? Is that something we want to look at as well? All of the companies are looking at environmental pollution as a potential concern about the same activity in that space. And here I'm showing it, presenting it as other companies. You can make yourself part of this data. You can put your company in here and see, how are we stacking up? If we've invested a lot of money in solving the problem of expensive manufacturing, and we're losing out to company R, has filed 6 patents disclosing this, they seem to be the ones with know-how. How do we solve that issue? How do we compete with them? How do we approach that situation? Or raw materials, right? What kind of raw materials are used in by different companies? So organic materials, others we can ignore, that's too catch-all, for example. So other ways of looking at, what raw materials might we want to look at based on what other companies are doing. And this is called a white space matrix. Maybe some of you have heard of this kind of analysis technique, but essentially you can take any two parameters you want as disclosed in patents and say, all right, we want to look at these materials as used in different applications, okay, for example. So organic material, and these are really generic examples, so I apologize, but okay, organic materials in the packaging industry, you can't really read it, but that's 184 patents. That's a hot area. If we want to start using organic materials in packaging industry, well, there's good technical feasibility there because a lot of people are disclosing patents on it, but there might be a high risk to enter that, meaning practice that because of all those patent rights, and there's already tough competition there potentially. But wherever there's white space, no one's recognizing that in the published literature, meaning, all right, carbon black is used in paper. There's 0 patents existing on that, at least for the companies we're analyzing here. So if there's no patent rights, there's low risk to enter that space, but conversely, does that mean there's a high technical hurdle to enter? Maybe that's the reason there's no patents there, is because either there's a high technical hurdle to enter, or other companies have already identified this is not such a lucrative market to be entering, potentially. But at least it gives us, a way of thinking about the next steps and what we need to investigate. And lastly, I want to discuss about legal feasibility. Basically, it's the same as using all that other analysis, just switching your brain from business and technical to the legal mindset. So, we already talked about risk and protection potential, but essentially, for me, legal feasibility is mainly 2 things. What's the risk and can we protect it? And at the minimum, this has to be done at the first stages of a project and again before pre-launch of a project. I work with companies who do this 5 times throughout innovation and R&D sometimes. But really the goal is to assess risk, reduce it, and resolve it. Assessing is, searching for those blocking patents, analyzing potential infringement. Reducing is figuring out how do we bypass those patents or evaluate the invalidity of those patents. Resolving is maybe getting permission or a license from the patent holder. Maybe you attack the patent rights themselves. The tools are what I just showed you, the landscape search, or perform more targeted searches on a particular product to see if any patents line up with that. So those are discussed previously. And the protection assessment, going back to that intellectual asset mindset, not focusing on patents, is broader. It's contractual. Can we do NDAs to prevent loss of valuable know-how to our competitors? NDA management is extremely complicated sometimes. I'm dealing with an interesting case now with NDA, but anyway, trade secrets, as you know, are establishing formal procedures for heightening protection. Patents, I think you're all aware of. How can we exclude our competitors from the market with our patent rights? And brand management, sometimes even just brand management, like the Dolby mark is famous, right? Can be really useful. I will admit I've seen cases where a product's been developed that really isn't that different from the existing product, but we marketed it into a completely new space that where the customers didn't really have that level of awareness about what was really in the product, and we branded it a new name and said, this is our premier whatever product, and the perception of value increases. Sounds kind of shady, but everyone does it, I think, and it's, brand value, it's really a perception thing, and there's a lot of strategy there that can increase the value. So in my final remarks, hopefully you can take away from this that real innovation is hard. There's a lot to consider, and it really has a low success rate. So as I touched upon, figure out how to integrate, or at least understand the need to integrate all that information externally and internally in your company, including the functions related to that, so that you can hopefully have more successful innovation. Understand what the key roles of business, R&D, and legal departments are and how they can synergize with each other. Expect more from your IP counsel. I see some IP counsel out there that I know, so I'm putting the heat on you, but expect more from them. I think, there's room for IP counsel to grow into more of a business sort of decision-making or, have more influence on the business And some of it comes from figuring out better ways to analyze patents and really give useful information to the decision makers. Think broadly in terms of intellectual asset management. Don't hyper-focus on patents. There's a lot more to protection and risk management when you innovate than just patents. And as I just showed you, utilize that public information that your competitors are disclosing to your advantage for your market technical and legal feasibility studies. And please consider the use of outside consultants to assist with that work. It can be very labor intensive. And if you don't have the resources in-house, there's always resources outside that you can use to help assist with those efforts. And I appreciate the time, and I'll be available the rest of the day if anyone has any questions or wants to discuss anything further with me. Thank you.
I want to give another big thank you to Jason for making his way all the way from Japan to join us here today. So thank you. Very informative.